A federal judge unleashed accusations at Pam Bondi, expecting her to crumble little. Did he know she had gathered evidence for months in preparation? Her response so confident yet so precise, she never raised her voice, but laid out facts so devastating. The judge's sudden silence said everything the courtroom needed to hear. The federal courthouse in Tampa stood imposing against the morning sky, its marble columns and broad steps a testament to the weight of justice. Inside courtroom 4B, the air hung heavy with anticipation, the scent of polished wood and old law books, mingling with perfume and cologne as reporters and legal observers filled the gallery to capacity. Judge Raymond Hartwell presided, his reputation preceding him like a storm front before rain, his bench raised above the room, his black robe impeccably pressed, his gaze sharp beneath silver brows as he surveyed his domain with thinly veiled contempt. The case had already made headlines, a controversial lawsuit with political implications that stretched beyond Florida's borders into Washington's divided corridors of power. The gallery whispered among themselves, pens poised over notepads, phones silenced but ready to capture whatever happened next. And then she walked in. Pam Bondi moved with the quiet confidence of someone who had faced countless courtrooms, her cream-colored suit a stark contrast to the dark wood and somber tones surrounding her. Florida's former attorney general now representing a case that had divided public opinion, her blonde hair framing a face that betrayed nothing of her thoughts. She placed her briefcase on the defense table, arranging her papers with methodical precision, aware of the eyes tracking her every move but focused only on the task ahead. Across the aisle, the opposing counsel exchanged glances, smirks hidden behind legal pads. They had heard Judge Hartwell's reputation with conservative attorneys, especially those who had served under Republican administrations. One whispered to another, "Hartwell's going to eat her alive." But if Bondi heard, she gave no indication. Instead, she straightened her spine, adjusted her jacket, and continued her preparations. Judge Hartwell's eyes narrowed slightly at the sight of her, his fingers drumming against his bench, a subtle tell that didn't go unnoticed. A court reporter took her position, fingers hovering over her stenotype, ready to record every word of what promised to be anything but a routine hearing. The gallery settled, the whispers fading to silence as the bailiff called the room to order. "All rise. The United States District Court for the Middle District of Florida is now in session." The Honorable Judge Raymond Hartwell presiding. The ritualistic words echoed through the chamber as everyone stood, all eyes moving between the judge and the woman who showed no trace of intimidation. As they took their seats again, Judge Hartwell shuffled papers before him, his microphone capturing the sound, amplifying it through the tense quiet. "We're here on case number 21CV4872, Jenkins versus the state of Florida," his voice carried. The weight of authority, but also something else, something personal that those familiar with his courtroom recognized. "Ms. Bondi," he said, her name pronounced with a slight emphasis that bordered on disdain. "I see you've joined the defense team rather recently." It wasn't a question, but an observation laden with implication. Bondi rose, standing straight-backed and steady. "Yes, Your Honor. I've been retained as lead counsel and have filed my appearance with the court." Her voice was clear, professional, betraying nothing of the undercurrents that everyone in the room could feel. Judge Hartwell leaned forward, his glasses sliding down his nose slightly. "And you're fully prepared to proceed today? This is a complex constitutional matter, not a simple criminal proceeding." The condescension in his tone hung in the air. Between them, a few knowing glances were exchanged among the court veterans present. This wasn't just procedural questioning. It was the opening move in what promised to be a contentious chess match. Bondi didn't hesitate. "I've thoroughly reviewed the case file, Your Honor. Constitutional law was my focus, both as Attorney General and in private practice." Her voice didn't rise, didn't falter, didn't reveal the slightest hint that she had registered the insult. Judge Hartwell's expression tightened almost imperceptibly as he realized his first jab had failed to land. "Very well," he said, flipping through the motion before him. "You filed to dismiss the plaintiff's amended complaint on grounds that seem—" He paused, looking up over his reading glasses. "Rather creative in their interpretation of precedent." Someone in the gallery stifled a cough that might have been covering a reaction. Bondi remained standing, her posture unchanged. "Our motion cites 15 separate cases, Your Honor, from both the 11th Circuit and the Supreme Court that directly support our position." She didn't raise her voice, didn't display frustration, just stated facts with the precision of someone who knew exactly where she stood. The judge's mouth twitched slightly as he set the papers down. Citing cases and understanding their application are quite different things. "Counselor," the opposing attorney smirked, leaning back in his chair, enjoying the show as Judge Hartwell continued. "I've read your predecessor's arguments and found them lacking in several key aspects. I hope your contributions improve the quality of what has so far been a disappointing defense." The comment hung in the air, a clear signal to everyone present that Bondi was walking into hostile territory. A less experienced attorney might have faltered, might have shown uncertainty, might have attempted to placate, but Bondi simply nodded once. "I believe the court will find our arguments compelling once fully presented, Your Honor." Her confidence wasn't brash or challenging, just matter-of-fact like steel wrapped in silk. Judge Hartwell's eyes narrowed further, studying her for a moment as if recalculating his approach. The room remained silent, the tension building with each passing second as two formidable forces measured each other. Finally, the judge looked down at his docket. "The plaintiff may proceed with their oral arguments on why this motion should be denied." As Bondi took her seat, the opposing counsel rose, adjusting his tie with the satisfaction of someone who believed the wind was at his back. But those watching closely noted something in Bondi's demeanor, a calm readiness, like a chess master who had already calculated several moves ahead. What Judge Hartwell didn't realize yet was that he had underestimated her in ways that would soon become apparent to all. The opening moves had been made, positions established, but the real battle was just beginning. And as the plaintiff's attorney launched into his arguments, Pam Bondi watched, listened, waited, her notepad filling with observations, her strategy adapting with each passing minute. The judge occasionally glanced her way, perhaps expecting to see doubt or concern, but finding only composed attention. The morning sun shifted through the high windows, casting long rectangles of light across the courtroom floor as the first chapter of this legal drama unfolded. No one present knew exactly how this would end, but everyone sensed that something extraordinary was about to happen. Pam Bondi hadn't always planned to take this case, sitting in her office the night before. Case files spread across her mahogany desk, lamplight casting shadows on decades of legal texts. She had known exactly what she was walking into. Judge Raymond Hartwell's reputation wasn't a secret in legal circles. His clerks called him the Hammer behind closed doors for the way he came down hard on attorneys he deemed unprepared or arguments he considered frivolous. But there was something else too, something the public didn't see in the carefully crafted judicial opinions or the measured comments to the press. A bias that had become more pronounced with each passing year on the bench. Bondi sipped her coffee, now gone cold, as she reviewed the case history. The plaintiff's attorney, Martin Reynolds, had clerked for Hartwell 15 years earlier, a connection that raised eyebrows but not quite enough for a recusal, she said. Down her pen, rubbing tired eyes. This wasn't just any case. It was a constitutional challenge that could impact election processes across the entire state. Political implications hung heavy in every motion and countermotion, every precedent cited, every argument crafted. Her phone buzzed softly on the desk, a text from her former deputy, Ag. Hartwell made another comment at the bar dinner, said, FL's political operatives were trying to undermine the judicial system. Bondi didn't need to ask who he meant by political operatives. She had heard about the judge's thinly veiled comments, his disdain for her former office under Republican leadership. She remembered their first encounter years earlier when she was a young prosecutor and he had just taken the bench. He had seemed fair then, demanding but impartial. Something had changed, or perhaps had always been there beneath the surface, waiting for the right moment to emerge. In the courthouse parking lot that morning, Bondi had sat in her car reviewing her notes one final time. She watched attorneys and clerks hurrying up the courthouse steps, briefcases in hand, some laughing, others serious-faced and focused. A news van pulled up, then another, camera crews unloading equipment, jockeying for position near the entrance. This case had drawn attention not just for the legal questions it raised, but for the personalities involved. Bondi checked her watch, closed her portfolio, and stepped out into the Florida heat. A reporter spotted her immediately, microphone extended, cameraman falling into step. "Ms. Bondi, any comment on Judge Hartwell's remarks at last month's judicial conference?" She smiled politely, kept walking. "I'm focused on the legal arguments today, not on comments made at social events. Professional, measured, giving them nothing they could use." As she climbed the courthouse steps, she noticed Martin Reynolds already at the top. Watching her approach, his smile didn't reach his eyes as he nodded in acknowledgement. "Quite the media circus, isn't it?" he said as she reached the landing. "The case deserves attention," she replied evenly. "The constitutional questions matter." Reynolds chuckled, adjusting his red tie. "Come on, Pam. We both know why the cameras are really here." He lowered his voice slightly. "Hartwell's been waiting for a chance like this ever since your office challenged his ruling in the Mackenzie case." Bondi met his gaze directly. "Then he'll be disappointed when I keep this strictly about the law." Reynolds shrugged, a smirk playing at his lips. "We'll see." Inside the courthouse security line, Bondi nodded to familiar faces. Court officers she had worked with, clerks who recognized her from previous cases. One security guard, a veteran with gray at his temples, leaned slightly closer as he returned. "All right, D. Courtroom 4B is packed already, ma'am. Standing room only." She thanked him with a smile, unsurprised but grateful for the information. In the elevator, two younger attorneys huddled in the corner, fell silent when she entered. She could feel their eyes, their curiosity, their assumptions. The defense table was empty when she arrived. Plaintiff's side already busy with preparation, Reynolds conferring with his associates, pointing to sections in their briefs. Bondi set down her briefcase, centered it perfectly on the table, a habit from her earliest days as a prosecutor. From her peripheral vision, she caught a court clerk speaking in hushed tones to Reynolds, both glancing in her direction. Moments later, the clerk approached, professional, but with a hint of caution. "Miss Bondi, Judge Hartwell has requested all counsel in chambers before we begin." An unusual request, but not unprecedented. She nodded, gathered her notepad, and followed the clerk through the side door, down the narrow hallway that led to the judge's chambers. Reynolds was already there, seated comfortably like someone who knew the terrain. Judge Hartwell looked up from his desk, his chambers more austere than most. No family photos, minimal decorations, just law books and case files meticulously organized. "Miss Bondi," he acknowledged, not rising, not extending a hand. "Your honor," she replied, taking the seat across from Reynolds, back straight, hands folded in her lap. "I wanted to address a few matters before we go on the record." The judge removed his glasses, pinching the bridge of his nose as if already tired. Though the day had barely begun, this case has attracted unnecessary attention. His eyes fixed on Bondi, implication clear in his tone. "I expect counsel to maintain the dignity of these proceedings regardless of outside interests." Again, his gaze lingered on her, as if she were the one who had called the press. Reynolds shifted in his seat, a small smile playing at his lips. Of course, Your Honor, he responded smoothly. We're all officers of the court here. Bondi didn't miss the subtle alliance forming between them, the unspoken understanding. I've reviewed your motion. Ms. Bondi, Hartwell continued. It differs substantially from your predecessor's approach. She nodded once. The legal strategy has been refined based on recent circuit court decisions. The judge's expression hardened slightly. I'm familiar with those decisions and their limited applicability here. He hadn't even heard her arguments yet, but had already dismissed them. Reynolds watched the exchange, silent but observant, enjoying the judge's clear preference. In my courtroom, Ms. Bondi, Hartwell continued, lean forward slightly. Grandiose constitutional claims require extraordinary support. The warning was clear, the double standard evident. Bondi met his gaze evenly. I believe the precedents we've cited provide exactly that support. Your Honor, her voice remained respectful, but underneath, steel reinforced every word. Something flashed in the judge's eyes, surprise perhaps at her unflinching response. He hadn't expected resistance. Not this early, not this composed. The clerk knocked lightly, opening the door without waiting. Your Honor, we're ready whenever you are. Hartwell nodded, replacing his glasses. The momentary uncertainty gone. We'll proceed immediately. As they rose to return to the courtroom, Reynolds leaned close to Bondi, voice low enough that only she could hear. He's going to make an example of you. You know, nothing personal. Just politics. Bondi didn't respond. Didn't give him the satisfaction, but as they walked back toward the courtroom, she knew with absolute certainty that this wasn't going to unfold the way Judge Hartwell planned. The packed gallery quieted as they entered, reporters straightening in their seats, attorneys pausing their whispered conversations. One moment before stepping through into the courtroom proper, Bondi caught her reflection in a window, her mother's words echoing from years ago. There are people who will judge you before you say a single word. Those are the ones you need to prove wrong, not with anger, but with excellence. She adjusted her jacket, lifted her chin slightly, and walked into the arena, ready for whatever came next. The courtroom settled into silence as Judge Hartwell assumed his position behind the imposing bench, arranging his papers methodically, a power move recognized by every attorney, establishing control and making everyone wait. Bondi sat still reviewing notes with practiced calm, while Reynolds leaned back, already feeling victorious. The court will now hear oral arguments on the defendant's motion to dismiss. Hartwell's authoritative voice filled the room, clipped and precise. Ms. Bondi, as this is your motion, you may proceed. His emphasis on your, a subtle reminder that he saw this as her personal crusade, not a legitimate legal position. Bondi rose smoothly, buttoned her jacket, and approached the lectern. Thank you, Your Honor. Her voice clear, measured, experienced. The state's motion rests on three key arguments, she began, citing precedents with precision, connecting seemingly disparate rulings. But 3 minutes in, Hartwell interrupted. Counselor Robertson v. Ellis doesn't apply in the context you're suggesting. His tone dismissive, condescending. Bondi nodded, unfazed. If I may direct the court's attention to Justice Alito's concurrence, particularly page 47, where he specifically addresses the question of standing in cases like ours, countering with quiet confidence, catching the judge off guard as he flipped through papers. Continue, he said curtly. Bondi pressed on, rebuilding momentum, but the pattern had been set. Hartwell's interruptions grew sharper. Ms. Bondi, your interpretation of Williams contradicts the 11th Circuit's application, to which she calmly replied, with respect. Your Honor, the 11th Circuit distinguished Williams in their ruling last year in Thompson v. Georgia, cited on page 23 of our brief, unwavering and precise. Reynolds shifted, scribbling notes furiously as Bondi gained traction, her argument compelling even to skeptics. But Hartwell, increasingly agitated, cut in again. "Miss Bondi, perhaps in the political arena, these kinds of sweeping generalizations are effective, but this is a court of law," a clear jab at her tenure as Attorney General. Reporters perked up, sensing tension, but Bondi remained poised. "Your Honor, my argument is based entirely on established legal precedent, as demonstrated by the 17 cases cited, not on political considerations," her response firm, professional, forcing Hartwell to shuffle his papers. "Proceed, counselor, but keep in mind this court's time is valuable," his way of rushing her. Though she had used only half her allotted time, yet Bondi adapted, prioritizing key points while enduring constant interruptions, each more pointed, more personal. "Ms. Bondi, that's a creative interpretation of the Commerce Clause, but not one this court finds persuasive," his tone openly skeptical, hostile. Yet she maintained composure, tension barely visible in her shoulders. "Your Honor, I'm not offering a creative interpretation, but rather applying the standard established in 5 consecutive Supreme Court rulings, listing them effortlessly." Law clerks in the gallery exchanging impressed glances. Hartwell's frustration mounted, fingers drumming against the bench. "Miss Bondi, are you suggesting that this court doesn't understand basic constitutional principles? A trap designed to force an apology or arrogance." The courtroom held its breath, Reynolds watching intently, but Bondi didn't falter. "Not at all, Your Honor. I'm simply clarifying the state's position and the substantial legal foundation on which it stands, perfectly sidestepping the bait, maintaining respect while asserting control." Hartwell's face tightened. "I believe I understand the state's position quite well, perhaps better than you realize, implying political bias." But Bondi let the pause linger before replying. "Then Your Honor will appreciate the constitutional significance of the precedents we've cited." Subtle pushback, perfectly measured, rippling through the gallery as Hartwell, caught off guard, asked, "Ms. Bondi, how much longer do you require?" Though she had 20 minutes left, "I have approximately 15 more minutes. Your Honor, if I may continue without interruption," calling out his tactics without directly challenging his authority, a masterful line that left Hartwell visibly flushed. "Proceed," his clipped response revealing frustration. Bondi pressed forward, but Hartwell was waiting, interrupting at the climax of her case. "Ms. Bondi, your entire argument seems to conveniently ignore the district court's ruling in Hartman, which directly contradicts your position. A deliberate trap, Hartman being a minor case from another circuit, but rejecting it outright would appear combative." Reynolds smirked, believing Bondi was cornered, but she barely paused before delivering a devastating counter. "Your Honor, I'm glad you raised Hartman, as the court is surely aware. Hartman was effectively overruled just 6 months ago by the Supreme Court in Davidson v. United States," seamlessly quoting Chief Justice Roberts' opinion from memory. "The reasoning in Hartman relies on a framework that this court finds fundamentally inconsistent with established constitutional jurisprudence, a knockout blow." Gasps rippled through the gallery, and Hartwell froze, realizing he had overlooked a critical ruling, his credibility momentarily shattered. Reynolds' confidence evaporated as he sank back into his chair, while Hartwell, exposed, could only muster a stiff, "I see." Bondi remained poised, showing no triumph, just professional resolve. "If I may continue, Your Honor?" she asked, fully in control now, Hartwell nodding stiffly. "You have 5 minutes remaining," allowing her to conclude with precision. The first round had gone to Bondi, but everyone knew Hartwell's wounded pride would make the real battle ahead far more personal. Reynolds approached the lectern, confidence partially restored now that it was his turn to speak. Judge Hartwell's demeanor shifted visibly, the harshness in his expression softening, his posture more relaxed, more receptive. Mr. Reynolds, you may present your opposition to the motion. The contrast was unmistakable, his tone almost warm compared to the clipped hostility he had shown Bondi. Reynolds nodded appreciatively. "Thank you, Your Honor." He launched into his counter-argument, speaking freely without interruption, referencing many of the same cases, but with interpretations that stretched credibility. Where Bondi had been repeatedly challenged, Reynolds was met with encouraging nods. Where her citations had been questioned, his were accepted without scrutiny. 10 minutes in, Bondi made a note on her legal pad, kept her expression neutral, though she had grounds for multiple objections. The double standard was blatant, visible to everyone in the courtroom. Reporters exchanged glances. Law students in the back row whispered. 15 minutes into Reynolds' presentation, he made a fundamental error, mischaracterizing the holding. In Thompson, Bondi straightened slightly, considered objecting, then made another note instead. Reynolds continued, gaining momentum from the judge's approval, growing more expansive in his claims, more dismissive of the defense position. The motion filed by Ms. Bondi represents a fundamental misunderstanding of constitutional principles. He gestured dramatically, playing to the gallery, more like a politician than an attorney. Perhaps understandable, given her background in politically motivated legal positions. The comment crossed a line, a personal attack rather than legal. Argument, grounds for immediate objection. But before Bondi could rise, Judge Hartwell nodded. An astute observation, Counselor. The comment hung in the air, shocking in its impropriety. A judge openly agreeing with a personal attack on opposing counsel. Several attorneys in the gallery shifted uncomfortably, even those who opposed Bondi's position recognized a breach of judicial conduct. Bondi's pen paused mid-note, her expression unchanged. But something shifted in her eyes, a decision being made. Reynolds continued. Emboldened by the judge's approval, Ms. Bondi's interpretation would effectively allow the state legislature to override federal protections established by this court. Judge Hartwell nodded again. A concerning implication, indeed. He was no longer even pretending to maintain judicial neutrality, now actively reinforcing Reynolds' arguments. The court reporter's fingers flew across her stenotype, capturing every word of the increasingly improper exchange, creating an official record that would later prove significant. 30 minutes in, Reynolds began addressing Bondi's Davidson citation, attempting to distinguish it from the present case. His argument tortured and contradictory. Judge Hartwell leaned forward. Mr. Reynolds makes an excellent point about distinguishing these precedents. He was now openly coaching the plaintiff's counsel, a breach of judicial ethics that had the gallery murmuring. Bondi wrote another note, her legal pad now filled with observations, each one a potential ground for appeal should the ruling go against her. Reynolds concluded with a flourish. The defense motion isn't just legally unsound. It represents a coordinated attempt to undermine this court's authority. Another personal attack, thinly disguised as legal argument. Judge Hartwell nodded approvingly. Thank you, Mr. Reynolds. A compelling presentation, as Reynolds returned to his seat, clearly pleased with himself. The judge turned to Bondi. Ms. Bondi, you have 10 minutes for rebuttal. The time allocation was inappropriate. Standard procedure allowed equal time, but she didn't challenge it. Instead, she gathered her notes, approached the lectern, her movements unhurried, her demeanor still perfectly composed. Thank you, Your Honor. She began her rebuttal, methodically addressing Reynolds' key points, exposing the logical inconsistencies in his constitutional interpretation. 3 minutes in, Judge Hartwell interrupted. Ms. Bondi, you're simply restating arguments already presented and rejected. The interruption was both unfair and inaccurate. She was directly responding to new claims raised in Reynolds' presentation. Bondi paused briefly. Your Honor, I'm specifically addressing Mr. Reynolds' characterization of Thompson, which forms the core of his opposition. I'm well aware of the arguments, Counselor, Hartwell responded sharply. Please move on to something substantive. The dismissal was so transparently biased that even Reynolds looked uncomfortable. Aware that the transcript would reflect the judge's increasingly obvious partiality, Bondi continued, adjusting her approach, focusing now on the constitutional foundations that even Hartwell couldn't easily dismiss with remarkable precision. She dissected Reynolds' arguments point by point, never showing frustration, never raising her voice. 7 minutes into her allotted 10, she reached the heart of her rebuttal, addressing the Davidson precedent that Reynolds had attempted to distinguish. The Supreme Court's ruling in Davidson directly controls in this case, regardless of Mr. Reynolds' attempts to suggest otherwise. Judge Hartwell's patience finally snapped. Ms. Bondi, this court doesn't appreciate having Supreme Court precedent wielded like some sort of political weapon. The comment was shocking, inappropriate, on multiple levels, suggesting that citing controlling precedent was somehow improper. A senior attorney in the gallery, a respected constitutional scholar, actually gasped audibly, but Hartwell wasn't finished. Perhaps in your previous role you became accustomed to grandstanding, but in my courtroom we expect a higher standard of conduct. The personal attack was unmistakable, a direct reference to her service as Attorney General and an insinuation of political motivation. The courtroom fell completely silent. Reporters frozen in place, attorneys staring in disbelief. Reynolds looked down at his notepad, aware that a line had been crossed that would have consequences. Bondi stood perfectly still, the attack hanging in the air between them, her face betraying nothing of what she felt. Time seemed suspended, the tension unbearable, everyone waiting for her response. When it came, her voice was quiet but carried to every corner of the room. Your Honor, with all due respect, my citation of controlling Supreme Court precedent is not grandstanding. It is my obligation as an officer of this court. She paused, just long enough to be noticeable, meeting the judge's gaze directly. And the court's obligation is to apply that precedent faithfully regardless of personal or political preference. The rebuke was delivered with perfect professionalism, wrapped in respectful language, but unmistakable in its substance. Judge Hartwell's face flushed deeply, his knuckles whitening as he gripped the edge of the bench. Ms. Bondi, you are bordering on contempt. The threat hung in the air, heavy with implication, but Bondi didn't flinch, didn't backtrack, didn't apologize. Instead, she stood straighter, her voice remaining measured and calm. Your Honor, if accurately citing controlling Supreme Court precedent and respectfully reminding the court of its obligation to follow that precedent constitutes contempt, then I invite the court to so rule. She gestured slightly toward the court reporter, whose fingers had momentarily frozen over the stenotype. And to make that finding part of the record, the implication was clear. She was inviting him to create an appealable error, one that would not survive scrutiny by the circuit court. Hartwell realized the trap. The anger in his eyes giving way to something more calculating, Bondi continued, her voice still perfectly respectful. However, I believe we would both prefer to address the substantive legal questions rather than procedural matters that might necessitate review. The message beneath her words was clear. She was giving him an opportunity to step back from the brink, to return to proper judicial conduct. The gallery held its collective breath, the confrontation having reached a critical point. The next word spoken would determine whether this became a legal landmark or merely another day in court. Judge Hartwell's response would reveal everything about his character and about how the rest of this case would unfold. The silence stretched. 1 second, 2 seconds, 3. His fingers drummed once on the bench, then went still. The silence in courtroom 4B had weight, substance, like the air before a storm. Judge Hartwell's threat of contempt still hung between them, but Bondi's calm response had changed something fundamental. The judge's fingers stopped their drumming. His gaze flickered to the court reporter, whose fingers hovered over her machine. ready to record whatever came next. He was suddenly acutely aware of the official transcript being created, of how his words would read when reviewed by the circuit court. He cleared his throat, adjusted his glasses. A reset of sorts. "Your remaining time, Miss Bondi," he said finally, his tone noticeably moderated. "Please proceed with your rebuttal." The gallery collectively exhaled. The immediate crisis averted, but the shift was palpable, undeniable. Bondi nodded once. "Thank you, Your Honor." She returned to her legal arguments, voice steady, posture straight, as if the confrontation had never happened, but something had changed in the air, in the dynamic between them. Her next citation went unchallenged, her constitutional analysis uninterrupted. Judge Hartwell watched her with new wariness, reassessing the woman before him. Reynolds scribbled notes furiously, sensing the shift, trying to salvage his strategy. When Bondi finished her rebuttal, she didn't return immediately to her seat, but remained at the lectern. Her gaze direct, her voice clear. "Your Honor, given the constitutional importance of the issues before the court, the defense requests permission to submit supplemental authorities, a standard request, typically granted as a matter of course, but in this context, loaded with significance." Hartwell hesitated, aware of the courtroom watching, aware of the record being created, aware of his options narrowing. "The court will permit supplemental filings from both parties," he conceded. "Finally, due in 7 days." Bondi nodded. "Thank you, Your Honor." As she returned to her seat, her heels clicking softly on the hardwood floor, the power in the room traveled with her. An attorney in the back row leaned toward his colleague, whispering behind his hand, "Did she just back Hartwell down?" His companion nodded slightly. "Never seen anything like it." Reynolds rose, trying to reclaim momentum. "Your Honor, plaintiff requests the opportunity for surrebuttal, an unusual request after arguments had concluded, a transparent attempt to have the last word." Before Hartwell could respond, Bondi rose smoothly. "Your Honor, if Mr. Reynolds is granted surrebuttal, the defense would of course be entitled to respond to any new arguments, reminding the judge of proper procedure, of the record being created, of the scrutiny that would follow." Hartwell's jaw tightened, trapped by his own earlier behavior, by the corner he had painted himself into. "The request for surrebuttal is denied," he said finally. "The court will take this matter under advisement." He gathered his papers, clearly eager to end the proceedings, to retreat and regroup. "We are adjourned." The gavel came down with more force than necessary, the sound cracking through the courtroom like a gunshot. As the judge disappeared through the door behind the bench, whispers erupted throughout the gallery. Reporters closed notebooks. Attorneys exchanged glances. Reynolds approached Bondi as she organized her materials, his earlier smugness replaced by grudging professional respect. "That was unexpected," he said quietly. "I've never seen Hartwell back down before." Bondi met his gaze, her expression professional but distant. This case deserved to be decided on the law, Martin, not on personal feelings. He nodded, understanding the deeper meaning behind her measured words. "He'll still rule against you," Reynolds said, but his tone lacked conviction. "Perhaps," Bondi replied, closing her briefcase with a soft click. "But now he'll have to do it with actual legal reasoning." As she turned to leave, she found her path blocked by a court security officer. "Miss Bondi," he said quietly, "Judge Hartwell requests you in chambers immediately." Reynolds raised an eyebrow, but Bondi's expression remained impassive. Of course. She followed the officer through the side door, down the same hallway as earlier that morning, aware of the whispers following her. Outside the judge's chambers, his clerk stood waiting, her expression anxious, her clipboard clutched tightly against her chest. "He's not in the best mood," she whispered as she opened the door. Bondi nodded once. "Thank you for the warning." Judge Hartwell sat behind his desk, his robes removed, his Tie loosened, a glass of water untouched before him. He didn't rise when she entered, didn't invite her to sit, his displeasure evident in every line of his body. "Close the door," he said curtly. Bondi did so, then stood before his desk, briefcase in hand, waiting. Hartwell stared at her, his expression a complex mixture of anger, wounded pride, and reluctant respect. That was quite a performance, counselor. Bondi didn't respond, didn't take the bait, simply waited, letting silence do the work. After a moment, Hartwell sighed heavily, gesturing to the chair across from him. "Sit down, Miss Bondi." She did so, placing her briefcase beside her, hands folded in her lap, patient, composed. "In 30 years on the bench," Hartwell said finally, "I've never had an attorney challenge me like that in open court. It wasn't quite an accusation. Not exactly a compliment. Somewhere in between, I wasn't challenging the court." "Your Honor," Bondi replied evenly, "I was defending my client and the constitutional principles at stake." Hartwell's eyebrow raised slightly. "Is that what you call it?" He leaned forward, fingers laced together on the desk, voice lower now, speaking colleague to colleague rather than judge to attorney. "We both know what happened out there." Bondi met his gaze directly. "Yes, Your Honor, we do." The simple acknowledgement hung in the air between them, neither backing down, neither looking away. "You were prepared for this," he said finally. "Not a question, a realization. I prepared. For the legal arguments, Your Honor." Her voice remained respectful but unflinching, as any attorney should. Hartwell nodded slowly, reaching for his water glass, taking a small sip. "Buying time. The Davidson case," he said finally. "That was well played. The closest thing to a compliment he seemed capable of offering. Supreme Court precedent is binding on all of us." Bondi replied, her tone softening just slightly, offering him a path toward professional reconciliation. Hartwell studied her, reassessing everything he thought he knew about the woman sitting across from him. "My clerk tells me the press is calling it the smackdown in 4B, he said finally, a hint of rueful humor breaking through his rigid demeanor. "The press often exaggerates, Your Honor," a diplomatic response, giving him room to save face. Hartwell nodded slowly, coming to a decision. "My ruling on your motion will be based solely on the legal merits." "Ms. Bondi," he said it like a concession, though it was nothing more than his basic judicial duty. "I would expect nothing less." "Your Honor." Her response was perfect, acknowledging his statement without absolving his earlier behavior, maintaining the new boundary she had established between them. Hartwell leaned back in his chair, studying her with new eyes, seeing not just a political appointee but a formidable legal mind who had outmaneuvered him on his own turf. "You know," he said finally, "your predecessor wouldn't have handled it the way you did. We all have different approaches, Your Honor. Her diplomacy was impeccable, her position uncompromised." Hartwell nodded once, a decision made. "My clerk will contact both parties when the ruling is ready." A dismissal, but not an angry one, more thoughtful, recalibrated. As Bondi rose to leave, Hartwell spoke again, his voice quieter now. "For what it's worth, counselor, there was impressive advocacy coming from him. After everything that had transpired, it was a significant admission." Bondi nodded once, acknowledging the comment without needing to respond. As she reached the door, he added one final thought. "I suspect we'll be seeing more of each other in the years to come." It wasn't a threat, as it might have been hours earlier, but a recognition of a worthy adversary. "I look forward to it, Your Honor," she replied smoothly, then closed the door behind her. In the hallway, the clerk was waiting, her expression a mixture of curiosity and awe. "Is everything ... okay?" she asked hesitantly. Bondi smiled, her first genuine smile of the day. "Everything is as it should be." As she walked down the marble corridor toward the courthouse exit, attorneys and court staff watched her pass, whispers following in her wake. On the courthouse steps, the afternoon sun bright against her face, reporters surged forward, microphones extended, questions shouted. But Bondi just smiled politely, declining to comment, walking steadily toward her car. She wouldn't discuss what had happened, wouldn't gloat, wouldn't criticize the judge publicly. She didn't need to. The transcript would speak for itself. The ruling would come on legal grounds. The system had been redirected toward justice rather than bias. And sometimes, the quiet victory is the most powerful kind of all. 3 days passed since the showdown in courtroom 4B. The legal community buzzed with accounts, some accurate, some exaggerated, all centered on the moment when Pam Bondi had stood her ground against one of the most intimidating judges in the federal system. In her hotel room, Bondi reviewed her supplemental brief, pages of meticulous legal analysis reinforcing arguments that had already proven effective. Her phone buzzed softly, a text from her former deputy. "Have you seen the transcript?" She hadn't. It typically took at least a week for official transcripts to be prepared, especially in high-profile cases where accuracy was paramount. "It's already circulating," came the follow-up message. Someone in the clerk's office must have expedited it. Moments later, her email chimed. The attachment opened to reveal the complete record of what had transpired in Judge Hartwell's courtroom. Bondi scrolled through, reliving each moment, each exchange, each turning point, seeing it on paper. The judge's bias appeared even more stark, his interruptions more frequent, his comments more inappropriate than she had registered in the moment. Most revealing were the exchanges after Reynolds' presentation, when Hartwell had openly sided with him, making comments that no impartial judge would ever allow themselves. Bondi closed the document, understanding immediately why it was circulating so quickly. The transcript wasn't just a record. It was a revelation, one that could potentially impact Hartwell's reputation, his legacy, perhaps even his career. Her phone rang, the caller ID showing Reynolds' number unusual for opposing counsel to call directly. "Martin," she answered, voice neutral. "You've seen it. Not a question, a statement." Just now. A pause, the sound of a door closing on his end of the line. "It's worse than I remembered," he said quietly. "Some of what he said to you, ... His voice trailed off, a rare moment of collegiality transcending their adversarial roles. "The question is," Bondi replied carefully, "why? Was it released so quickly?" Reynolds hesitated, then lowered his voice further. "Word is, Hartwell tried to have portions redacted, claimed they were off-the-record comments, but the court reporter refused." Interesting, significant, a court reporter standing her ground against a federal judge. "The Judicial Conduct Committee is already involved," Reynolds continued. "This transcript doesn't just document our case. It documents a pattern." Bondi processed this information, understanding the implications. "This isn't just about our motion anymore," she said finally. "No," Reynolds agreed. "It's much bigger now." After they hung up, Bondi stood by the window, watching evening descend on the city, weighing her options, considering her responsibilities not just as an advocate, but as an officer of the court. Her supplemental brief sat on the desk behind her, ready for submission. Arguments refined and strengthened, but something felt incomplete, a missing piece, a necessary response to what had transpired. She returned to her laptop, opened the new document, and began to write. Not the next day, but on the morning of day 7, the final day allowed for submissions, Bondi returned to the federal courthouse. She bypassed the clerk's office where supplemental briefs were typically filed and headed directly to courtroom 4B. Judge Hartwell was hearing motions in a different case. The gallery sparsely populated with only a few attorneys and observers. Bondi slipped into the back row, listening as Hartwell questioned counsel, noting the difference in his demeanor, more measured, more cautious than days earlier. When the court recessed for lunch, Bondi approached the court officer at the side entrance. "I need to see Judge Hartwell in chambers," she said quietly. "It's regarding the Jenkins case." The officer nodded, familiar with her from the previous hearing, and disappeared through the door. Moments later he returned, gesturing for her to follow. Hartwell was at his desk, tie still perfectly knotted, glasses perched on his nose. Reviewing documents, he looked up as she entered, surprise briefly crossing his features before he composed himself. "Miss Bondi," he acknowledged, setting down his pen. "I wasn't expecting you. I apologize for the unscheduled visit, Your Honor." He gestured to the chair across from him, more courteous than during their last encounter. "I assume this concerns your supplemental filing?" Bondi placed her briefcase on her lap, opening it carefully. "Yes, Your Honor." She removed a sealed envelope, placed it on his desk, then a bound document, her supplemental brief, as complete and persuasive as any she had ever written. Hartwell glanced between them, uncertainty in his expression. The envelope? Emotion. "Your Honor," Bondi replied, her voice calm but serious. "One I wanted to deliver personally." Hartwell's expression tightened, suspicion replacing uncertainty as he reached for the envelope, breaking the seal with his letter opener. He removed the document inside a single page, formal heading, precise legal language. As he read, his expression shifted first surprise, then disbelief, finally something approaching respect. "A motion to recuse?" he said finally, looking up at her. Bondi nodded once. "Yes, Your Honor." Hartwell set the paper down carefully, studying her with new intensity. "On what grounds?" Though the question was unnecessary. The grounds clearly stated in the carefully worded document before him. "The transcript, Your Honor," Bondi replied simply. "It speaks for itself." Hartwell leaned back in his chair, fingers forming a steeple beneath his chin, considering her, considering the document, considering his options. "You realize," he said finally, "that judges rarely grant motions for their own recusal." "I do, Your Honor." "Yet you filed it anyway." "It was the right thing to do," she replied. No challenge in her voice, just quiet conviction. Hartwell studied her, trying to discern her strategy, her motivation, her endgame. "Most attorneys," he said slowly, "would have taken that transcript straight to the circuit court, filed for mandamus, made a public issue of it." Bondi nodded, acknowledging the point. "That option remains available, Your Honor, should it become necessary." The implied threat, delivered with perfect courtesy, hung in the air between them. "But you chose this approach instead," Hartwell observed. "Why?" The question seemed genuine, his curiosity overcoming his defensive posture. "Because this isn't about winning at all costs," Bondi replied, her voice softening slightly. "It's about the integrity of the process." She gestured toward the motion. "This gives the court the opportunity to acknowledge what happened and to correct it without external intervention." Hartwell's eyebrow raised slightly, surprised by her approach, perhaps even by her restraint. He picked up the motion again, reading it more carefully, noting the absence of inflammatory language, the focus on judicial canons rather than personal accusations. "This is ... measured," he said finally, almost reluctantly. "The law should be Your Honor." He set the paper down, studying her with new eyes, reassessing everything he thought he knew about the woman sitting across from him. "You could have made this very public," he observed. "Very damaging." "That wouldn't serve justice," Bondi replied simply. "Just as your continuing to preside over this case would not." Direct, honest, but not disrespectful. Hartwell nodded slowly, reaching a decision. "I'll take this under advisement," he said finally, gesturing to both documents, the motion and the brief. "Thank you, Your Honor." As Bondi rose to leave, Hartwell spoke again, his voice different now, almost reflective. "Miss Bondi," She paused, hand on her briefcase. "You handled this exceptionally well." The admission seemed to cost him, but he made it nonetheless, both in court and now. Bondi nodded once, accepting the comment without needing to elaborate. "The law deserves our best, Your Honor, even when it's difficult." She closed the door softly behind her, leaving Hartwell alone with the motion, with the transcript, with his conscience. 3 days later, the clerk's office issued a notice to all parties in Jenkins v. Florida. Judge Raymond Hartwell had recused himself, citing an abundance of caution and to ensure the appearance of impartiality. The case would be reassigned to Judge Michaels, a jurist known for fairness, for careful analysis, for judicial temperament. No mention was made of the transcript, of the confrontation, of the motion that precipitated the decision. 2 weeks after Judge Hartwell's recusal, the case of Jenkins v. Florida came before Judge Rebecca Michaels, a 20-year veteran of the federal bench known for her meticulous legal analysis and scrupulous impartiality. The courtroom was packed, even fuller than before, attorneys squeezing into back rows, law students sitting cross-legged in aisles, reporters clutching notebooks, their pens poised and ready. They hadn't come for the constitutional questions or the nuances of federal jurisdiction. They had come to see Pam Bondi, the attorney who had faced down Hartwell and emerged victorious. Bondi moved through the crowd quietly, acknowledging colleagues with nods, but avoiding the press entirely, her focus solely on the case ahead. Reynolds was already at the plaintiff's table, surrounded by associates, looking less confident than us before, more thoughtful, more prepared. As Bondi arranged her materials, a hush fell over the gallery. Judge Michaels entered, her robes perfectly pressed, her gray hair cut in a practical bob, her expression revealing nothing of what she might be thinking. "Please be seated," her voice calm but authoritative, carrying to the back of the room without need for amplification. "The court has reviewed all filings in this matter thoroughly, including supplemental briefs from both parties." Her gaze moved between Bondi and Reynolds, assessing both equally without favor or bias. "I am aware of the circumstances surrounding Judge Hartwell's recusal and have read the full transcript of the previous hearing." A slight murmur rippled through the gallery, hushed immediately by a sharp glance from the judge. "Those circumstances, while procedurally significant, cannot impact my consideration of the legal questions before this court." She shuffled papers briefly, establishing her command of the case before continuing. "I will hear all arguments on the defendant's motion to dismiss, but will limit each side to 30 minutes as I find the briefs quite comprehensive." She turned to Bondi. "Ms. Bondi, you may proceed when ready." Bondi approached the lectern, adjusted the microphone slightly, and began her presentation, not with flourishes, not with drama, just clear, precise legal arguments, building methodically upon each other, creating a compelling constitutional framework. Judge Michaels listened, intently, occasionally asking questions that cut straight to the heart of complex issues. Her interruptions neither hostile nor friendly, just precisely targeted to test Bondi's reasoning. "Counselor, how do you reconcile your interpretation of Section 23 with the Supreme Court's analysis in Thompson?" The question was challenging but not confrontational, aimed at clarifying a potential weakness in the defense position. Bondi responded confidently, distinguishing Thompson, explaining how subsequent rulings had modified its application, her analysis thorough and persuasive. Unlike the previous hearing, this was a genuine legal dialogue, a testing of ideas, a search for constitutional truth. When Bondi concluded exactly on the 30-minute mark, Judge Michaels nodded slightly, an acknowledgement of professional competence, if not necessarily agreement. Reynolds followed, his presentation more measured than before, less performative, more substantive, as if the lessons of the previous hearing had not been lost on him. When both sides had finished, When all questions had been answered, when the legal framework stood fully articulated, Judge Michaels spoke again. "I will take this matter under advisement and issue a written ruling promptly." She gathered her notes, her expression revealing nothing of which way she might be leaning. The court is adjourned. The gavel fell once. Court officers called for all to rise, and Judge Michaels departed, leaving attorneys and spectators alike to wonder what would come next. Outside the courthouse, reporters clustered around Bondi, shouting questions about Hartwell, about the transcript, about the legendary confrontation. But Bondi deflected gently. Today was about the constitutional issues, not about personalities or past proceedings. I have nothing further to add at this time. Professional, disciplined, focused on what mattered. Back in her hotel room that evening, Bondi reviewed her notes from the hearing, analyzing Judge Michaels' questions, searching for indications of how she might rule. Her phone buzzed softly, a text from her former deputy. "Entire judicial conference is talking about Hartwell. Word is he's considering retirement." Bondi set the phone down, feeling no satisfaction in the news, only a quiet acknowledgement that actions have consequences, sometimes larger than intended. She returned to her case notes, focusing on the work ahead, whatever the outcome might be. 3 days later, Judge Michaels issued her ruling, a 30-page opinion meticulously researched, carefully reasoned, addressing every argument from both parties. The core constitutional question analyzed through historical context, through precedent, through careful statutory interpretation. The conclusion reached not through bias, not through predisposition, but through the weight of legal authority properly applied. The defense motion to dismiss was granted. Bondi had won, not just procedurally, not just technically, but substantively, on the merits of her arguments, on the strength of her legal reasoning, on the constitutionality of her position. Reynolds called within the hour, his tone respectful, almost collegial. "I'll be filing an appeal, of course." No bitterness in his voice, just professional acknowledgement. "But it was well argued, Pam." "Yours as well, Martin," she replied, meaning it. Legal adversaries, but not enemies, both serving a system larger than themselves. The press coverage that followed focused primarily on the ruling itself, on its constitutional implications, on its potential impact on future cases. But some stories couldn't help mentioning what had happened before: the confrontation with Hartwell, the recusal, the changing of the guard. A reporter from the Washington Post caught Bondi outside her office 3 days after the ruling. "Ms. Bondi, many are saying that Judge Michaels' decision validates your stand against Judge Hartwell. What's your response to that?" Bondi paused, considering her words carefully, aware of their potential impact. "The only validation that matters is that the Constitution was properly applied and justice was properly served." She turned to go, but the reporter pressed on. "Judge Hartwell announced this morning that he's taking senior status, effectively semi-retirement. Any comment on that decision?" Bondi stopped. This was news to her, significant news. But her expression revealed nothing of her thoughts or feelings. "I wish Judge Hartwell well in whatever path he chooses." Simple, dignified, neither gloating nor critical. As she walked away, the reporter called after her. "Many are calling you a hero for standing up to judicial misconduct. How does that feel?" Bondi turned back, just for a moment. The real heroes are those who uphold the law every day without recognition or praise. Judges who maintain their impartiality. Court reporters who create accurate records. Clerks who ensure proper procedure. All doing their part to make justice possible. Her words weren't calculated, weren't crafted for headlines, but spoke to something deeper about her understanding of the system and her place within it. In the weeks that followed, the story gradually faded from the headlines, replaced by newer controversies, fresher scandals, as the news cycle moved relentlessly forward. But in law schools across the country, The transcript became required reading. In courses on professional responsibility and judicial ethics and judicial conferences, the case was discussed as a cautionary tale about the dangers of allowing bias to infect the legal proceedings. And in courtrooms, some judges became more careful, more conscious of their words, more aware of the line between tough questioning and inappropriate conduct. One afternoon, nearly 2 months later, Bondi received a call from the Chief Judge of the 11th Circuit. Ms. Bondi, I'd like to invite you to address our upcoming judicial conference on maintaining the integrity of our courts, an honor rarely extended to practicing attorneys. Recognition of what she had accomplished, not just for her client, but for the system itself. I would be honored, Your Honor, she replied simply. After hanging up, she stood by her office window, watching sunlight play across the city below, thinking about what had transpired, about silence and its power, about standing firm without seeking destruction, about the difference between winning a case and serving justice. What had happened in courtroom 4B hadn't just been about a judicial smackdown, as the press had initially framed it, or about a personal victory over a difficult judge. It had been about something far more fundamental, the quiet insistence that the law belongs to everyone, that no one is above it, that principles matter more than personalities, that sometimes the most powerful statement is the one you don't need to make. Because in the end, it wasn't Bondi's words that had created change. It was her refusal to be silenced, her standing firm when it mattered, her understanding that true power doesn't shout to be heard. It simply stands its ground and lets the silence speak for itself. 6 months after Judge Michael's ruling, in a grand ballroom at the Capitol Hilton, the American Bar Association held its annual gala celebrating excellence in the legal profession. Tables draped in white linen filled the room, champagne glasses catching the light from crystal chandeliers overhead. Judges mingled with attorneys, law professors with Supreme Court clerks. The elite of America's legal community gathered to honor their own. At a table near the center, Pam Bondi sat quietly, listening more than speaking, observing the interactions around her with the same careful attention she brought to everything. She hadn't sought the invitation, hadn't expected to be nominated for the Distinguished Advocacy Award, one of the profession's highest honors. Her work on Jenkins v. Florida had been about serving her client, about upholding constitutional principles, not about recognition or acclaim. Across the room, at a separate table, sat Judge Raymond Hartwell. His appearance a surprise to many, his first public event since taking senior status. Their eyes met briefly across the crowded space. A moment of silent acknowledgement, neither hostile nor particularly warm, just a recognition of shared history, of a pivotal moment that had changed them both. The ABA president approached the podium, tapped the microphone, and began the evening's program. Presentations and speeches followed, celebrating pro bono work, constitutional scholarship, landmark victories in civil rights cases. As the Distinguished Advocacy Award approached, a video began playing on large screens positioned throughout the ballroom. Not footage of Bondi's courtroom arguments, not clips of press conferences or media interviews, but instead a montage of young attorneys speaking directly to camera about what her example had meant to them. She showed us that you can stand your ground without losing your professionalism. It changed how I approached difficult judges, knowing the principle can prevail. She reminded the entire profession that justice isn't about personalities, it's about process. A young woman, barely a year out of law school, looked directly into the camera. I keep a copy of that transcript on my desk to remind me why integrity matters, especially when it's difficult. As the video concluded, the ABA president returned to the podium. This year's Distinguished Advocacy Award goes to someone who reminded us all that true advocacy isn't just about winning cases. It's about upholding the integrity of our entire legal system. Bondi rose, walked to the podium, accepted the crystal trophy with gracious thanks. The audience applauded warmly, many rising to their feet, a genuine expression of professional respect. Bondi adjusted the microphone, her gaze taking in the assembled crowd, judges and attorneys, adversaries and allies, all part of the same essential system. "Thank you for this honor," she began simply, though in truth, I was just doing my job. A soft chuckle rippled through the audience, appreciating her understatement. We talk often about zealous advocacy, about fighting for our clients, about winning at all costs. But there are times when advocacy requires something more difficult, something more nuanced than simply fighting harder. Her voice remained measured, neither lecture nor sermon, just quiet reflection offered to colleagues. It requires us to remember that our system depends not just on brilliant arguments or persuasive rhetoric, but on shared respect for process, for fairness, for the rule of law itself. From his table, Judge Hartwell watched silently, his expression unreadable, but his attention unwavering. What happened in courtroom 4B wasn't about a personal victory or a dramatic confrontation. Bondi continued, her gaze sweeping across the room. It was about a moment when our system was tested and ultimately proved resilient. She paused, letting the words settle, because that's what matters most. Not who wins a particular case, not who delivers the most compelling argument, but whether justice itself is served. Murmurs of agreement, nods of understanding, the words resonating with the assembled legal minds. The greatest lesson I've learned in my years of practice is that advocacy, at its best, defends not just clients, but the principles that protect us all. As she concluded her brief remarks, the applause that followed was genuine, thoughtful, a recognition of something important being articulated. As guests mingled afterward, a law professor from Georgetown approached Bondi, notebook in hand. "Ms. Bondi, I used the transcript from your hearing with Judge Hartwell in my legal ethics class." She smiled. "I hope as a positive example." He nodded. "Of course, but students always ask what I consider the most important moment, and I'd value your perspective." Bondi considered the question carefully. Many would point to her challenge, to the judge's threat of contempt, or perhaps the Davidson citation that had exposed his lack of preparation. "The most important moment," she said finally, "wasn't anything caught in the transcript." The professor looked confused. It was what happened after when Judge Hartwell had the opportunity to reflect on his conduct and chose to recuse himself. She gestured subtly toward Hartwell's table across the room. That showed the system working, as it should, which matters more than any individual triumph. The professor nodded slowly, understanding the deeper point, making notes in his small journal. As the evening wound down, attendees gradually dispersed, heading to hotel rooms or late dinners or waiting cars. Bondi collected her award, said her goodbyes, and headed toward the exit. In the grand foyer, as she waited for the valet, a voice spoke behind her. "Miss Bondi." She turned to find Judge Hartwell standing several feet away, his bow tie slightly loosened, his expression guarded but not hostile. "Judge Hartwell," she acknowledged, maintaining professional courtesy. "Congratulations on your award," he said, his voice carrying no sarcasm, no bitterness, simply stating a fact. "Thank you, Your Honor." A silence stretched between them, heavy with unspoken words, with shared history, with mutual recognition. "Your speech was insightful," he said finally. Bondi nodded, accepting the comment without elaboration. Another silence, not uncomfortable, but purposeful, as if both were choosing words carefully. "I've had time to reflect," Hartwell said eventually, his voice lower now, meant only for her ears, "on what happened in my courtroom." Bondi waited, letting him find his way to whatever he needed to say. "It wasn't my finest moment on the bench." The admission, clearly difficult for him, hung in the air between them. "We all have moments we would handle differently." "Given a second chance, Your Honor," She offered the words not as absolution, but as professional courtesy, one colleague to another. Hartwell nodded once, accepting her response for what it was. The system worked, he said finally. Not as I expected, not as I would have preferred, but it worked. Perhaps the most honest assessment he was capable of giving. Yes, Your Honor, it did. As the valet approached with Bondi's keys, Hartwell extended his hand, not presuming, not expecting, simply offering. Bondi accepted the handshake, brief, but firm, a professional acknowledgement of something important. No words of forgiveness needed, no expressions of regret required. Just the simple recognition that they had both served the same essential purpose. As she drove away, Bondi reflected on the evening, on the award, on the unexpected encounter. It wasn't about winning or losing anymore. It wasn't about who had bested whom in a courtroom confrontation. It was about something more fundamental. About a system that could correct itself. About principles that transcended personalities. About the quiet triumph of integrity over bias and personal agenda. What had happened in courtroom 4B had sent ripples through the legal community, changing how attorneys approached difficult judges, how judges checked their own conduct, how court reporters understood their vital role. Small changes, perhaps. Individual adjustments, but multiplied across thousands of courtrooms, they represented something profound. For Bondi, returning to her hotel room, setting the Crystal Award on the desk. The greatest victory wasn't the trophy, wasn't the accolades, wasn't even winning the case. It was knowing that somewhere a young attorney facing an impossible situation might find courage in her example, might stand firm when it mattered, might remember that silence in the face of intimidation isn't agreement or submission, but sometimes the moment just before truth speaks with its clearest voice. Sometimes the most powerful statement isn't what you say, but how you stand and who you remain when the world is watching. If you've ever faced a moment where standing your ground felt impossible, where speaking truth seemed dangerous, where integrity came at a personal cost, remember this. Silence doesn't always mean surrender. Sometimes it's just the pause before justice finds its voice. And sometimes the quietest actions echo the loudest long after the gavel falls. So what's your story? Have you ever had to stand up when everything was stacked against you? Share your thoughts in the comments below, and don't forget to subscribe for more stories of courage, principle, and the moments that define us.